This is Metro Week. Our top story, Tucson Unified School District's ethnic studies courses are again under state scrutiny. We'll ask the district's superintendent what that means.
We do see the value in providing students an opportunity to see themselves reflected in history, to see themselves reflected in literature.
Plus, our Journalists Roundtable analyzes the week's news.
I'm Andrea Kelly. Tucson Unified School District has for years offered courses that highlight the Mexican American, African American, Native American, and Asian American perspectives on history and literature. A couple of years ago, some of those courses received state scrutiny. Fernanda Echavarri has our look at what happened then and the latest in this story.
For the last 3 years, Tucson's largest school district and the State Department of Education have been in disagreement about TUSD's Mexican American Studies classes. In 2012, then Superintendent of Public Instruction, John Huppenthal, said the classes violated a state law that was written with TUSD in mind. The law says it's illegal in Arizona to teach classes that promote the overthrow of the U.S. government and promote resentment toward a race. TUSD was the only school district in Arizona found in violation of the law, although dozens of schools across the state teach Mexican American Studies classes. The TUSD governing board voted to shut down the classes rather than lose millions in state funding in 2012. Hundreds protested the move and the issue got national attention. A year later, TUSD was required to offer history and English classes taught from a Mexican American and African American perspective as part of a decades-long federal desegregation case. TUSD, with the oversight of a federal judge and the state, developed the new curriculum, and last fall, students began taking those classes. The Arizona Department of Education did not seem to have a problem with the Mexican American Studies curriculum until on his last day as superintendent, Huppenthal wrote a 6-page memo saying TUSD was again in violation of state law. This time, he also included complaints about the district's African American Studies classes. On her first week as Arizona's new school chief, Diane Douglas met with TUSD Superintendent H.T. Sanchez to discuss the complaints. Douglas did not take the non-compliance letter off the table. She expressed support for the ethnic studies curriculum at TUSD. However, she said that the way that some teachers are implementing it may be violating the law. After the meeting last week, Sanchez said he expects TUSD and the State Department of Education to have a better relationship this time around.
Joining me in the studio now is Tucson Unified School District Superintendent H.T. Sanchez. Thanks for coming in.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the opportunity.
Let's start our conversation by looking back at the decades-old federal desegregation case that actually requires TUSD to teach these culturally relevant courses. What is that court order? Why does it require you to do that?
Well, the case is 40 years old. It and I both share that in common. And so coming in to the district in 2013, the Unitary Status Plan had just been signed, and in the Unitary Status Plan, because there was a empirical research study done at the University of Arizona that showed the ethnic studies courses were really good for minority students, especially Hispanic students, in preventing the dropouts of our Hispanic students. The court, when it took a look at what could help improve the district, felt that offering ethnic studies from a Mexican American and African American point of view, these classes that would be engaging and would reflect the students and they would see themselves in the curriculum would be a benefit.
And studies have also since shown the same thing about academic performance, correct?
Right. We've actually seen a replication of the study. So we have the original study and then we have a replication of that study that actually, when the data were cleaned further, indicated that the academic achievement was even better than first thought in the original study, the original Cabrera study out of the University of Arizona.
And then in December, former State Superintendent of Public Instruction, John Huppenthal, issued a letter, cited the TUSD, saying it was out of compliance with state law on these ethnic studies courses that you're teaching now in compliance with that federal desegregation order. So what did that letter say? What was it asking or saying?
You know, it was a real interesting letter. It alleged that, of course, the law reads that anything we do that teaches hatred towards a race of people or the overthrow of the government or ethnic solidarity is against the law in Arizona, which, of course, is being challenged in the Ninth Circuit. And I hope the Ninth Circuit does the right thing and that law is eliminated. But nonetheless, the outgoing state superintendent said that the use of certain songs as well as rap music and certain materials were violating that law. I failed to see where he makes a point. I do agree that some of the materials that we were using, we could do a better job, but in terms of violating the law, I just don't see it. But we are willing to see how we can work with the state. Again, I stand by our teachers. I feel that they have the right heart, but violating the law, I don't see that.
So former State Superintendent John Huppenthal issued that letter the last day in office, and then current State Superintendent Diane Douglas took over. You two have spoken in the meantime. What was that conversation like?
It was a very positive and productive conversation. I had tried for a month to schedule a meeting with the previous state superintendent to try to understand if there were any issues, but the meeting with Diane Douglas was a very positive meeting. She seemed very open and willing to work through what John Huppenthal left as, I would say, probably the last blight on his legacy. I mean, we're being accused of violating a law that he himself violated by using pseudonyms online and making racial comments against a group of people. And so by this gentleman, he says that we violate the law in the same way that he did. But nonetheless, Superintendent Douglas was very positive. And where I feel good is the outgoing superintendent didn't have a Latino advisory group. Diane Douglas is putting together a Latino advisory group. She invited me to be a member of that, and in this advisory function, provide a bit of perspective on how curricula could infuse the Latino perspective, triumphs, tribulations, and so on and so forth, into the Arizona educational standards.
She has said that the issues with the classes, and you've mentioned it in this interview, are with the way they're being taught, not with the fact that they're being taught. How can you change that? What can you do to come in compliance?
Well, you know, she felt that the curricula was sound and that there were a few, and it wasn't pervasive. In my conversation, she said there are a few teachers that, from their review of materials, might be on the edge or might be over the edge in their perspective. And so, from my point of view, I really feel that our job is to work with our staff and to address those few. Again, I really don't concur with the outgoing state superintendent's point of view, but I am willing to sit down and review our materials and sit down and willing to have the conversation with teachers. A lot of people get confused into believing that to teach ethnic studies, you have to teach hatred. Ethnic studies are the exact opposite. It's about understanding. One of the findings in John Huppenthal's letter, the in she felt was a teaching of hatred or misunderstanding. It actually is the golden rule from the Aztec point of view. It's fascinating that something like the golden rule, understanding, could be found out of compliance with law.
So that hits on the fact that this can be really subjective. This is a matter of opinion about a violation. How do you ever bridge that?
Well, you know, it's fascinating because as people, we're a reflection of our life experiences. I mean, as we sit here today, we're the culmination of everything we've experienced. And so I hope that the new state superintendent will seek to understand the points of views and be open to dialogue, because it's only through communication that we're able to resolve long-standing issues. If you want an issue to continue to be a perpetual issue, then let's not communicate about it. So I'm very hopeful through our submission of documents, our submission of lesson plans, as well as I've invited and we've already scheduled a visit from the Arizona Department of Education to come to TUSD to see what happens in the classroom, to meet the teachers, to meet the students, to see the passion, to see what occurs in those classes, and that, there's nothing wrong with taking a look at history from multiple points of view. It helps us make better decisions in the future.
And let's remind people that a couple of years ago, when this came up the first time, the state law says you either come into compliance with how the classes are being taught, or you lose state funding, a portion of state funding. Yeah. And the district actually got to that point a couple of years ago and decided to cancel the courses in order to make sure you still got your full allotment of state funding. How close do you think you're going to get to that type of a decision you're going to have to make this year?
You know, we find ourselves in an interesting position because the court order, the unitary status plan, says from a federal judge, signed off, you have to offer them. So in terms of saying, well, we're just not going to offer them, we'll just solve our problems by pitching it aside and we'll just move forward, that's not an option. And even if it were an option, it's not something that we're interested in doing. We do see the value in providing students an opportunity to see themselves reflected in history, to see themselves reflected in literature. That's the magic behind the dropout rate reduction. That's the magic behind academic achievement. I don't feel that we'll be at that same point. I feel that the understanding from the state superintendent is different. I don't see her with those same racial biases that the outgoing superintendent had, and I don't see our teachers with a desire to try to make a name for themselves by fighting for the sake of a cause that through dialogue and understanding we can better resolve.
It sounds like you're saying you think the bulk of the work here is in educating the superintendent or the Department of Education about what the classes are, more so than changing the classes themselves.
Right. I mean, we're really, we feel good about what we have. The state superintendent in her press release said the AD, the Arizona Department of Ed, has no problem with the curricula, rather its implementation. So it's a matter of, if that's where the issue is, a review of documents isn't going to show are we implementing the curricula well. It's going to be a matter of they need to come in, they need to walk down the halls with us, they need to walk into the rooms with us, they need to see what's going on. And then if there's an issue with it, let's talk about what that is, debrief, and then as a district leader working with our principals and teachers, we make the adjustments and we address the concerns. And so, you know, I've had the opportunity to visit our classes at Cholla and Tucson High and Pueblo, and I see good teachers, I see them working hard, and I see engaged students. A class in Tucson High, there was a high school class at Tucson High, there were no off-task students. Everybody was working and they were fully engaged, and it was a diverse class, and that's a beautiful thing.
Compare that to a regular history or literature class.
You know, I've been, as a high school, former high school teacher, former high school principal, I have been in many classes, and you don't always have that high level of engagement. You know, you tend to see that in your AP classes, in your general ed classes. It's more of a challenge, but in these classes, that challenge isn't there. I mean, the kids were engaged. The teacher was interested in the content to the point that the students could feel it and wanted to be part of it.
Dr. Sanchez, thanks for coming in today.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Rivera. Next on Arizona Week, the governor stated the state and his budget plans for the year.
I am just not persuaded by appeals to raise taxes so we can spend more.
Now our Journalist Roundtable. Joining me in the studio is my colleague Fernanda Echavarria of Arizona Public Media, Dylan Smith of the Tucson Sentinel, and Alexis Wicochea of the Arizona Daily Star. Thank you all for coming in today.
Thank you.
Fernanda, I'm going to start with you, and we're going to stay on the topic of TUSD's culturally relevant courses, the ethnic studies courses. We talked with Superintendent Sanchez a little bit about what was different this time around versus a few years ago, but there are a few more differences he didn't touch on. So what changed in this iteration of alleged violations of state law with ethnic studies courses?
There was one thing that was added this time around that was not mentioned in the previous complaints from the state about the Mexican American Studies classes. The state has now actually complained also about some of the materials and the way that they were being taught in some African American Studies classes, and that was the first time that we saw that coming out of the state's office.
And still no allegations of any other, are there other ethnic studies courses happening in TUSD?
Yes, there are, and in many school districts across Arizona, TUSD is not alone on this, but this is the first time that the state has added to the complaints at TUSD with the African American Studies classes.
We mentioned in the previous interview that the superintendent has changed in the last couple weeks, and the state superintendent has changed in the last few weeks. Also, Dr. Sanchez has been in office at TUSD for about a year and a half. So the last time around when this was going on, there was a different superintendent. How has that change in leadership on both fronts changed this conversation this time so far?
I think we could all agree that it seems from both the state superintendent and Superintendent Sanchez that it seems that the conversation is now more open than it was before, that there's more communication between the state and TUSD. H.T. Sanchez mentioned to some of us at a press conference that he tried to get meetings with previous Superintendent Huppenthal, and he wasn't getting anywhere, and within the first week in office, Diane Douglas sat down with him for over an hour to talk about the classes. So it sounds like there's much more communication between the state and TUSD, which in the end it makes for a better setup, I guess, to resolve these issues, and both parties want to resolve these issues. It
Coming
sounds like.
from the state level, Diane Douglas still thinks that these classes are in violation. It's not like the state's ready to just throw this case away, right?
Yes, she could have removed that order. She could have taken that off the table, and she didn't do that. She did say that she supports the curriculum, but she still thinks that the way some teachers are teaching it and some pieces of it may be violating the law.
But we are seeing, you both were nodding when Fernanda was talking about the conversation being more open. You agree you've seen more communication so far?
Definitely. I think something that the superintendent of TUSD found to be really positive is the fact that Superintendent Douglas said that she is hopeful that this will work out, and even questioned why these classes are not in place K-12 across the Tucson Unified School District. And that's not something I think we've heard from the previous superintendents.
Diane, we just heard from Superintendent Sanchez. What are we hearing from Diane Douglas's office, Fernanda?
We have not gotten, and I think I speak for you guys as well, one-on-one interviews with Superintendent Douglas since she had this meeting with HT Sanchez. But she did put out a statement, and I guess really what we've heard from her is what we are hearing from her office in the form of an email and a statement. And it goes to what Alexis was saying. She even mentioned that she is satisfied and pleased with the curriculum and doesn't want to just remove the classes, make them go away, but instead she wants to make sure that they are, whatever issues are there, are fixed so that they can continue to be taught in the district.
Which does sound like a different approach than a few years ago, which was a lot more black and white, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how much time does the district have to comply with this order at this point?
From the time they got the letter, they have 60 days, which would make it the beginning of March 4th. And I think it's safe to assume that both parties would like to get this resolved sooner than later. I don't think TUSD or the state want to wait until the last minute to see whether or not they fix the issues.
Okay. And Alexis, you've been covering the district for years, certainly through the last iteration of this similar case a few years ago. Can you give us some idea of the community response and how that's changed from the first time around to this allegation of violation of state law?
It's definitely a different response than we've previously seen. It's a really divisive issue. You have on one side parents and community members who feel like ethnic studies have no place in the classroom whatsoever, and that the focus should really instead be on the basics, on reading, writing, math, science, history, and anything beyond that is probably a waste of time. But you have the supporters who previously were shouting from the rooftops in the middle of governing board meetings, going against the police, walking out of classrooms, shouting to save these classes. And while it's a little bit more quiet this time around, we're not necessarily seeing that. We are seeing people come to TUSD governing board meetings just to get called to the audience. And they are still requesting that these classes be saved. So they're doing that here locally, they're doing that across the country. So it's definitely, it's not dead. There are still supporters.
What's the level of enrollment in these courses right now? Previously, when it was under Mexican American Studies, the MAS classes, it was not that high. How many kids are taking these culturally relevant classes now?
I'm not certain about how many there are, but I also know there are fewer sections than there previously were, and the superintendent of TUSD has said that's because it's been a challenge to find educators willing to teach these classes, partially because of the scrutiny that they have to face as a result of it.
With people from the state and people from the community coming into the classes to observe all of the time, and
right.
People from the district observing.
Right.
Now, Alexis, do you see this as something that's going to be an ongoing issue? Maybe every few years the district is going to be having this conversation with the state?
It's hard to tell. I mean, I've been covering the issue for 4 or 5 years now, and it goes back even beyond that, back to 2007 with Tom Horn calling for the elimination of the classes, and the scrutiny has been intense since then. Under the new superintendent, Diane Douglas, it seems like it's possible that if she does come to a place where she is satisfied not only with the curriculum but with what's happening inside of the classroom, then it could possibly be the end of it. But it's hard to see that right now when it's been going on for so many years.
So maybe we'll get some more clarity as we see how this works out.
I think so.
Okay. And then on a separate but related topic, you were in San Francisco this week at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, listening to an appeals hearing on a case regarding this actual state law. Can you set up kind of what the basics of that court case are?
Sure. So the law went into effect at the end of 2010 and essentially led to the dismantling of the previous Mexican American Studies program in TUSD. The law itself prohibits courses that promote the overthrow of the U.S. government, promote resentment against a race or class of people, advocate for ethnic solidarity, rather than treating students as individuals. And the final provision of that is courses that are designed primarily for one particular ethnic group. So that is the law in itself. The plaintiffs in the case are arguing that the law is overly broad and vague and it violates students' right to freedom of speech. They also feel that the state acted with discriminatory intent in enacting it in the first place and in enforcing it by basically denying students the right, Mexican American students specifically, to a course of study that research has shown to be highly effective.
This is a case that's been brought by the students themselves, or probably former students at this point, not the district, right?
Right. Originally, it was brought by TUSD educators, ethnic studies educators, and students, separate from the district. And over time, many of those individuals were found to not have standing. So now it really rests on the shoulders of two students, Maya Arce and Karina Lopez, and they are actually the daughters of ethnic studies educators Sean Arce and Lorenzo Lopez Jr.
Are they seeking to have the entire law overturned or piecemeal action on parts of that law?
They would like to see the entire law overturned. The state, on the other hand, has argued that the law is constitutional, and they are actually asking that one of the provisions of the law, the one that focuses on courses that are designed primarily for one particular ethnic group, that was previously struck down by the lower court for being overly broad and was ruled as unconstitutional. So the state is asking that that piece be reinstated. So that's also before the court.
Okay. And then we just heard Superintendent Sanchez say he hopes that the court does overturn this law, gets rid of it. But the district is not actually a party to the case. What have you heard coming from the district about this case?
Right. The district is not a party to the case, but they are aware that they have a lot to gain by it being overturned. As you all mentioned, what's at stake is 10% of their monthly state aid being withheld until they can come into compliance, and annually that's about $14 million a year. So the Superintendent Sanchez shared with me that without the law in place, it would allow his teachers to focus on the work without that threat hanging over their heads. Minimally, he said if the law is not overturned, he really wants to get some clarity to understand when school districts are in compliance and when they are in violation.
So it's not so as subjective as we discussed in the interview.
Right.
Moving on to another education topic, Dylan, this is just going to be an education discussion the whole time. But we heard the State of the State speech this week from new Governor Doug Ducey, and he actually spoke a lot about education, less than some people would have liked to hear, but there were definitely education components in his speech. Can you tell us a little bit about what he said?
Well, in the State of the State speech, there weren't a whole lot of specifics. Ducey laid out some broad strokes that seemed to point more towards supporting charter schools, giving charters the ability to take over public schools that have been closed and are sitting there, and letting that taxpayer asset be used by a private corporation for a charter school. And really, one thing that's been a big question all week is how he would approach most of the education budget for the state. And he just released his budget this afternoon, Friday afternoon, and we're looking at a $75 million cut to the state's university systems and a 5% cut in K-12 to non-classroom expenses. And that's not just administrators who are in an office shuffling papers. That's, school nurses and psychologists and the cooks and bus drivers and the gas and maintenance on buses, and even down to maintaining a saxophone for the the school band. All that kind of stuff is getting cut. Pretty not drastically, but a 5% cut is a pretty severe cut for most school districts that are already been so pressured by having so much money held back. And that really doesn't seem to be something that in the quick glance I was able to take this afternoon that is addressed in the budget, is what to do about this $300 million that is owed by the state to the schools.
And that actually goes back several years ago. Taxpayers approved the education budget going up by inflation, if not more, every year, and the state stopped doing that a few years ago. So that $300+ million is like back. What would be owed for this year.
That's what would be owed every year. Right. And the state's looking at about more than $1 billion in back pay that is supposed to be owed, and that's something that's getting wrangled in court right now.
And actually, Fernanda, that case was in court this week, but we still don't have a resolution. Can you just bring us up to speed really briefly about what happened with that case?
I think to basically just summarize what happened this week is a judge told both the state lawmakers and the school districts, sit down and figure it out.
Without a lot of guidance.
Without a lot of guidance. So it's trying to figure out on their own how to or when to or if to distribute this money in the way that the schools would want to see it, while still being the state lawmakers in a year where we're facing a deficit in the state budget. So no resolution on that as of yet.
Which is, yeah, I was going to say, kind of takes it back to where it was anyway with the court case. Figure it out. We're not figuring it out. Let's take it to court. And now we still need to figure it out. So.
Yes.
And Dylan, I also wanted to ask you about another big topic in education, big in terms of the amount of attention it got this week, was this new civics test that students will have to pass to graduate high school. This was a top initiative from the governor. Background on that and where we are?
Well, taking courses about government, learning about how government works has always been a requirement to get a high school diploma in Arizona. But now there's basically another test that students are going to have to pass to graduate, which is going to be based on the test that people have to take to become naturalized and become citizens. And which may be a good idea, but if you really dig into what this test is, there are some flaws in the test that the U.S. government administers to prospective citizens. There are answers that are, supposedly the right ones that are actually not really true. And that's, we're going to be requiring high school students to parrot back answers that are supposedly correct that aren't actually the truth.
And that was passed through both chambers of the Arizona
That was the first order of
legislature
business of this session, was for the State House and Senate to pass this and for Governor Ducey to sign that into law. That was the most important thing they had to get done.
That's what I was going to ask you. Do you think it's actually the most important thing on his agenda? Just the easiest thing to get done? How big of a deal is it?
For a whole lot of people, that's a pretty feel-good issue. I mean, and I think most people would agree that students should probably be better educated about how our society works and how government works and how they can take part in that. Most of us would nod our heads yes to that. But the details are, a little bit more interesting.
As they always are when we have these discussions. Yeah. Speaking of the details, I should just add that we did get the governor's budget proposal today, but that'll get hashed out through the course of the legislative session, and so we're not really sure if those cuts that you mentioned are going to be final. That's the proposal
that's
today.
The proposal that came out, and that's going to have to be the subject of much discussion, I'm sure.
Fernanda, how do school districts handle their budgeting process when they get a number from Governor Ducey in January? The fiscal year starts in July. How are they figuring out right now what they should be planning to spend?
From my experience, and Alexis and I have sat through very long board meetings at TUSD, that there's preparation even from the beginning of the school year, sort of anticipating what they think that the legislature will give them, what the governor might do. So school districts are planning and writing budgets that are sort of tentative budgets for most of the first few months of the calendar year, and then of course they change when they see how much money they'll actually be getting.
And then I think sometimes we've seen maybe some drastic cuts that need to be made after the school year starts. Is that what, or is that usually all taken care of before?
They generally have funds set aside. They tend to do a really good job of planning for worst case scenario and setting funds aside in the event that their projections were right, and usually can dip into that. It's not generally the case where you find that in the middle of the school year they're going to be in the red. So
they're looking ahead almost always. Okay.
Yes.
And then in our last minute or so, Alexis, I wanted to ask you what the school district's responses are to some of these initiatives that Governor Ducey has brought up, specifically that civics test that's now state law. What are you hearing from the classrooms, the principals, the superintendents about implementing that?
As far as the civics tests go, I know there's always concern about the amount of time they have in the classroom to get across the material that they need, especially implementing Common Core. So that's just another added layer that they're going to have to figure out a way to fit into their schedules. Other proposals that have been presented by the governor, like the closed school sites, the Tucson Unified School District has always been pretty resistant to leasing or selling their schools to competing charter schools, so they do have concerns about that. They seemed pretty hopeful about the portion possibly offering funding to expand schools, and believe that it would be positive if the state gives equal opportunity for both district schools and charters to apply for and receive that funding.
Great. Well, I appreciate all of you coming in this week. Lively discussion about education, and we're not done there, so we'll have you back as we go. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And that's it for this week on Metro Week. For more on this week's news, including stories that aired on NPR 89.1, go to our website. Now, Arizona Week takes a closer look at the State of the State address.